Hey guys, tonight we begin with the dimly lit world of the spiritualist seance assistant. The unseen hands and quiet footsteps that made ghosts appear in parlors from Boston to Birmingham between the 1880s and the 1920s. A time when belief blurred with performance and the line between comfort and deception was as thin as a candle flame in the dark. Before we begin, if you enjoy these quiet late-night wanderings, feel free to like the video and subscribe. It keeps our little circle of listeners growing. And in the comments, tell me where in the world you're listening from and share the strangest story or oddest bit of history you've ever heard. I love seeing what strange corners of the past you've stumbled across. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a candle burn low, or put on that soft rain track you like, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you think your job is strange, imagine one where your main skill was convincing a room full of strangers that the dead were leaning in to say hello. You're not the medium. The medium's in the spotlight, or rather the candle-flickering twilight, hands delicately resting on a velvet-draped table, pupils dilated to theatrical proportions. They murmur phrases like, "I feel a presence," while you're curled up beneath them, shoeless, silent, and waiting for your cue to yank a wire. You are a seance assistant. Not quite a stagehand, not quite a con artist, but absolutely the one with sore knees. It's somewhere between 1880 and 1920. Across Britain and America, death has become a national hobby. Cholera, influenza, and, eventually the First World War, have turned dining rooms into mourning chambers. People crave closure, or at least one more conversation with someone whose voice they remember better than their face. Spiritualism surges, and mediums spring up like toadstools after a storm. But they don't work alone. Every dramatic levitation, every ghostly whisper, that's you. You arrive early, you set the trap. Maybe you've rigged the ceiling with a pulley that will drop a trumpet mid-session. Maybe you've tied a string around the table leg to vibrate it in time with the moaning. Theatrical ghost moaning, that is, not your own. Your uniform is darkness and quiet. If someone sneezes mid-seance, you have to freeze like a guilt-ridden Victorian gargoyle. If the cat jumps onto the seance table, as one famously did in a 1903 New York sitting, you roll with it and hope no one notices the ghostly meow came from under the floorboards. Legend has it some assistants trained to imitate pet sounds just in case. This is not a glamorous job. You're crouching in tight spaces, often for hours. Your knees hurt. Your back hurts. You don't get the audience's reverent tears or post-seance hugs. You get soot in your hair and wax under your fingernails. The medium might toss you a wink or a 10-shilling note if they're generous. Some are true believers who think you're helping the spirits reveal themselves. Others know it's bunk and pay you to stay quiet. A few clients even want to be fooled. Historians still debate how many seance attendees were duped versus complicit. For some widows and parents, the illusion was more merciful than silence. They might see the handkerchief flutter mysteriously and choose not to see the thread. You learn how to read the room from below. The foot tapping means start the cold draft. The cough is your signal to knock twice. You develop a sixth sense for knowing when someone's about to shout fraud and ruin the whole night. Some assistants got good enough to double as performers, throwing their voice, mimicking whispers, even reaching out with chilled gloves to brush someone's hand. And all of this in pitch darkness, total sensory deprivation, except for muffled sobs and your own breathing. You begin to think of the seance not as a trick, but as a kind of theatre, except the prop's a fishing line and the stakes are emotional collapse. You also get good at disappearing. No one wants to see the ghost sweat. The second the candles flare back on, you've got to be gone, or at least well hidden. A floorboard panel here, a trapdoor there. One assistant in London reportedly used a hidden dumbwaiter to vanish between rounds. But of course, nothing stays hidden forever, not even you. Welcome to the golden age of grief, somewhere between the American Civil War and the second global catastrophe of the 20th century. You live in an era where death is not so much a possibility as a statistical certainty, with a flair for drama. If it's not typhoid or tuberculosis, it's your cousin vanishing in France, or your younger sister coughing herself to ghosthood. Everyone has lost someone, often several someones, and mourning has become both public ritual and personal performance. Enter spiritualism, the tantalizing promise that death is less a wall than a velvet curtain. It's a movement, a religion, a business. In the United States, it takes off just before the Civil War, kicked off by the notorious Fox sisters and their alleged spirit rappings. By the 1880s, it's a transatlantic obsession. By the 1920s, it's profitable grief, franchised. This is where you come in, not as a medium, not as a believer, but as the hands-on technician of hope. Séance assistants become essential backstage workers. Someone has to rig the trumpets, the luminous paint, the phosphorescent gloves. You might be stuffing ectoplasm, a word that in practice means cheesecloth or gauze soaked in egg white, into hidden compartments. You learn to mime a ghost's handshake using a peeled potato. Don't laugh. It's been done. The Victorian world loves gadgets, and you wield them like a haunted MacGyver. Hidden bellows to blow cold air, thread to make a table tremble, a stick with a fishhook for pulling flowers off a sideboard. When a grieving mother gasps that she smells her dead son's cologne, she doesn't know you spritzed it onto the carpet half an hour earlier. Or maybe she does. That's the strange part. Historians still debate how willing the audience was. For every fervent true believer, like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who remained convinced even as fellow intellectuals howled fraud, there were others who simply wanted to feel less alone, even if it meant buying the ticket and suspending disbelief. You provide that service, comfort, with just enough showmanship to stir tears. It's not just war that fills the séance chairs. The Spanish flu sweeps across continents, stealing 50 million lives in under 2 years. Newspapers report séance attendance spiking in its wake. Parents clutch handkerchiefs. Husbands tremble. And you? You're under the floorboards, cueing the sound of soft footsteps with a hidden plank. But not everyone approves. The church hates it. Scientists loathe it. Even some magicians take it personally. Harry Houdini, former escape artist and very loud skeptic, begins a campaign to expose mediums in the 1910s. He sees people like your boss as parasites on grief. He's especially furious when he catches the tricks he used on stage being passed off as divine contact. He makes it his life's mission to shut your operation down. The job gets riskier. Some séances now begin with the demand. No physical contact, no darkness, no movement. Suddenly your tools are cut in half, and the success rate of spirit manifestations drops accordingly. Some mediums adapt, incorporating psychic messages or automatic writing, but for you, the hands-on assistant, the shadows are the only stage where you shine. Still, the grief economy thrives. After World War I, Britain alone has over 700,000 widows. The US loses more than 100,000 soldiers. Families want connection, not closure. And for a while, the industry gives it to them, with velvet-draped séances, flickering lights, and the ghost of a handshake. You know it's all trickery. But when someone leaves the room with tear-streaked cheeks and a lighter step, it's hard not to wonder, maybe this is a service, not a scam. Maybe. But eventually the curtains will open, and someone's going to look under the table. You don't have a resume. You have a toolkit and it rattles. Tucked inside, a length of piano wire, some luminous paint, radium if you're lucky, phosphorescent zinc if you'd prefer your bones to not glow. Later, a couple of bell-shaped trumpets and at least one pocket sewn specifically for a spirit hand. The hand, by the way, is rubber, lightly powdered and attached to fishing line. You've named it Clarence. Clarence has done a lot of emotional heavy lifting over the years. Tonight's séance is in someone's sitting room, as always. It smells like damp lace and too much lavender. The host offers tea. You politely decline. You're already sweating through your collar. As the medium greets the guests upstairs, you descend into the basement with your toolkit and your talent for staying absolutely unseen. The séance assistant is never introduced. You're not the feature, you're the fog machine. Your job begins hours before the séance. You tap walls looking for hollows. You check the chair legs for creaks. You rig bell wires under the floorboards that connect to the table upstairs, so a subtle tug makes it thrum like a harp with secrets. You stuff gauze into compartments in the medium's blouse. You pre-cut the muslin that will emerge from her mouth as ectoplasm, pre-moistened with egg whites and maybe glycerin. It's unpleasant. And for you, deeply hands-on, there are stories, unverified but persistent, that some assistants had to actually place the ectoplasm into the medium's body before the séance. Where, exactly, we'll leave to your deeply regretted imagination. Let's just say it wasn't always her mouth. Once the prep is done, it's time to disappear. You're under the table, or inside a false cabinet, or curled behind the settee with a thin sheet over your head, praying no one lifts the drape. You listen, always listening, for cues, for footsteps, for the sound of someone shifting too loudly in their grief. Your tools are primitive, but your timing has to be surgical. Tap the bell once, then 3 soft knocks on the underside of the table. Wait, let the silence stretch. Then blow gently through the rubber tubing concealed in the table leg, just enough to flutter the curtain. Someone gasps. You smile, quietly. There's a reason magicians call this misdirection. The medium draws the eyes, the voice, the sacred hush. You draw the curtain, the wind, the invisible contact. You're the stage manager of the dead. In some circles, your role becomes almost artistic. In London's more theatrical parlours, séance assistants are taught to produce cold spots, using metal rods chilled in ice water, slipped through specially carved holes in the floor, or to create ghostly music by plucking harp strings hidden in the wall cavity. If you're lucky, you get to handle the spirit trumpet, a conical device painted with luminous symbols. In complete darkness, you use a concealed rod to move it around the room while murmuring into a tube. Voila, Grandma's voice, in a falsetto and a bit of reverb. But the best trick in your kit is silence, stillness, perfect timing. One wrong sound, one mistimed knock, and the spell breaks. Someone shouts, "What was that?" And you freeze mid-creep, a wire in one hand and Clarence in the other. Occasionally you're caught. There are whispered scandals, mediums exposed when the lights were turned on too early, or assistants spotted crawling out from under a sofa. One infamous assistant in Boston was found wedged inside a grandfather clock. He claimed he was resonating. The press was not kind. Still, the gigs keep coming because people want it. The ritual, the theatre, the illusion of reaching through the veil. And you? You're the one stitching the veil together from cheesecloth string and exactly one peeled potato. But you're also beginning to wonder, how much longer can you keep this up without being seen? It's séance night. Again, you've folded yourself into a space the size of a steamer trunk. Your foot's asleep. There's a sharp something, possibly an old nail, digging into your thigh, but you don't dare shift. Upstairs, the guests are gathering. There's laughter, thin and nervous. Someone whispers, "Do you think he'll come through tonight?" And the air goes quiet, as if even the walls are holding their breath. Your fingers find the thread. Literally, a piece of black silk, invisible in low light, tied to the corner of the tablecloth. It runs down through a crack in the floorboard to your hand. One tug, and the table will shiver. 2 tugs, and it'll respond. 3, and the medium will gasp and start pretending her dead Uncle Harold is in the room. You've rehearsed this. Harold always says something cryptic. He was very cryptic in life. Every movement counts. One séance assistant, writing anonymously in a 1917 exposé, described their role as choreography for the dead. It's not far off. You wait for the moment the medium closes her eyes. That's your cue to knock. Once, twice, lightly. The guests hold hands. Someone stifles a sob. Then, the bell. You pull the wire. The little brass bell on the mantelpiece, rigged with thread and a hidden magnet, rings once, soft as a breath. There's a collective inhale upstairs, followed by a whispered, "Did you hear that?" Yes, they did. And it's about to get worse. You've got a hollow cane, painted black, that snakes up behind the curtains. Inside it, a thin rubber tube. You exhale gently, sending a draft across the back of someone's neck. If you're lucky, they'll faint. This happened once in Leeds. She collapsed mid-séance, hit the carpet, and woke up claiming she saw her late husband. You nearly broke a rib trying not to laugh. And then comes the climax. The lights dim further, gas lamps turn low or candles nearly guttering, and the trumpet begins to float. You're half standing now, arms stretched painfully through a hidden slit in the wainscoting. You've practiced this for weeks. The trumpet, suspended on a black rod, moves slowly above the guests' heads, spinning, dipping, stopping just short of the widow on the left. She's weeping now. The medium starts to hum. You mouth Harold's lines into a hollow tube. The trumpet speaks. "I am with you. I never left." The effect is devastating. The widow clasps her chest. Someone whispers, "He always said that." Later you'll find out Harold never said anything of the sort, but grief is like wet plaster. It takes whatever shape you press into it. Historians still debate how many séances were deliberately fraudulent versus unconsciously theatrical. Some mediums believe they were merely helping spirits along. Others knew it was a racket, pure and simple. And you? You're stuck somewhere in the middle. Part craftsman, part confidence man, part reluctant priest. And always sore, because this work is murder on the joints. Hours crouched in darkness, breathing shallowly, timing every move with the rhythm of other people's mourning. One assistant in 1912 ruptured a disc trying to reach a spirit bell during a poorly planned séance. Another dislocated her shoulder while hiding behind a piano. You dream of ergonomic chairs and occupational health standards, but then remember it's 1910 and your job isn't technically real. There's a reason you're paid in cash, and silence. As the séance ends, you begin your quiet escape. The lights are still low, the medium's collapsed in apparent exhaustion, a bit of muslin hanging theatrically from her mouth. The guests murmur blessings. You slide backward through the hidden crawl space, counting seconds until you can stand upright again. You made it. Tonight's performance was clean, efficient, and deeply upsetting. In other words, successful. But tomorrow, you've heard that magician is coming, the one who likes to catch people like you in the act. And Clarence is starting to look suspiciously overused. There's a new guest at the séance tonight. You hear his shoes before you see him. Polished, heavy, sceptical. He's not here to cry. He's here to expose. probably a magician, or worse, a psychical researcher. They travel in packs now, with notebooks and rulers and a deeply unfunny sense of humour. This one clears his throat like a man preparing to duel with a ghost. You know the type. Houdini made them fashionable. He started as a stage magician, then decided he hated anyone who used his tricks to comfort widows. By 1920, he's America's most aggressive ghostbuster, showing up at seances with hidden chalk cameras and the occasional secret code. Once, he stuffed a seance trumpet with blue powder. When it came back down from its ghostly spin, the powder was gone, proving someone had handled it. Not very spiritual. You suspect your medium won't pass Houdini's test. Few do. Tonight's skeptic isn't Houdini, but he has that same face. Set jaw, arms folded, waiting. You adjust your tactics accordingly. No floating trumpets, no whisper tubes, just subtle things. A knock here, a sigh there. It's less Broadway, more off-Broadway with a nervous tech crew. But it's getting harder. The magic acts have gotten personal. Magicians and skeptics see what you do as theft. They spend years perfecting illusions, and then spiritualists borrow them, drape them in lace, and sell them to grieving strangers. Researchers from the Society for Psychical Research have started cataloguing tricks like yours. Table tilting, automatic writing, phantom touch. They publish pamphlets, give talks, even attend seances in disguise. One hid under a table with a flashlight. You'd have admired the commitment if it hadn't burned your shin. The war is on. Science versus spirit, illusion versus belief. And you're caught in the middle, a technician with dirty fingernails and a slightly haunted conscience. You try to innovate. You switch to infrared flower dust to track movement, unseen in candlelight. You modify Clarence to collapse on command. You experiment with using pre-recorded wax cylinders for ghostly voices, but it's tricky. The crank noise ruins the mood, and phonographs are heavy. Hauling one up a dumbwaiter while pretending to be invisible is not ideal. Some assistants get bolder. They team up with true believers, creating elaborate rituals that feel real even if they're not. Others go corporate. Yes, really. One medium in Chicago hired 3 full-time assistants and advertised guaranteed manifestations or your money back. The fine print, the guarantee expired 15 minutes after the séance. Very modern. Still, the cracks are forming. You hear whispers after sessions, guests wondering aloud why the spirits always speak in vague metaphors, why they rarely mention last week's weather or Aunt Mildred's boil, why the ectoplasm smells like egg. Historians note that by the 1920s, public confidence in séances began to wane. The combination of debunkers, disappointed clients, and a few high-profile exposures, like the time Marjorie the medium's ghostly voices were traced to a hidden microphone, sent the spiritualist movement into defensive mode. You feel it too. Fewer séances, tighter budgets, no more fresh cheesecloth. Clarence's rubber skin is cracking. You once had a toolkit. Now you're improvising with shoelaces and dental floss, and the skeptics just keep coming. They sit with arms crossed, silently counting seconds between table knocks. One fakes a sneeze to watch for movement. Another shines a flashlight directly under the medium's chair. It catches your sleeve. You jerk back. Too late. Someone gasps. Someone else whispers, "Was that?" And just like that, the séance is over. No more mystery, no applause. Just awkward silence and the sudden, unmistakable sound of a chair being pushed back. You don't wait to see who's standing. There are only so many ways to disappear. You've used the dumbwaiter, the floorboard trap, the trick cabinet with the fake back. Once, in a moment of pure desperation, you escaped through a coal chute wearing your best black suit. You spent the next week coughing up soot and self-respect. But tonight, there's no trick, no time, just footsteps, hard, fast, certain. The skeptic has seen you, or enough of you to start a scene. The medium is stammering something about the veil being disturbed. The guests are confused. One of them starts to cry. You're already halfway out the back door. It's time for an exit strategy. Some séance assistants pivot. They go into stage magic, openly this time. Become illusionists, escape artists, or vaudeville performers. Others trade séances for demonstrations, still vague enough to imply spirit contact without actually saying so. A few go full bore into mentalism, claiming psychic gifts instead of mediumship. At least with telepathy, you don't need a fishing line. And then there are those who just vanish. No forwarding address. No more Clarence. They simply walk away one day and never look back. You imagine one of them, now living in a quiet seaside town, working in a bookshop, muttering table rappings under their breath every time someone slams the register drawer. But quitting isn't easy. For one thing, you've gotten used to the cash. Mediums pay well, especially the famous ones. In London, some assistants make more in a month than a clerk earns in a year, especially if they stay quiet when the press starts sniffing around. For another, there's the loyalty. If you've worked with a medium long enough, you know their secrets, and they know yours. One word from you, and they're ruined. One word from them, and you might find yourself blacklisted from every parlour in town. There are stories of assistants being bought off, bribed by skeptics to turn whistleblower. Some do. They go on lecture tours with stage magicians demonstrating how the old tricks worked. You can tell who they are because they always say things like, "The spirits never paid me as well as the living." Others try to pivot again into real spiritual work. Mediums call it crossing over. It means convincing yourself that maybe, just maybe, you weren't faking it all. That maybe those knocks weren't just you. That maybe something did move the trumpet once, and you just happened to be holding it. Historians still debate whether some séance workers believed their own theatre. One assistant in New York insisted to her dying day that her ectoplasm sometimes moved on its own. Another claimed he never pulled the string on that last knock, though he was holding it at the time. You feel the weight of the job in your bones, literally. Your knees ache in cold weather. You've lost track of how many hours you've spent curled beneath tables, breathing through your mouth, heart pounding as someone inches too close. You've memorized the sound of someone trying not to believe, and you've learned how far people will go to stay convinced, how a grieving mother will thank you for the knock you know you made, how a war widow will squeeze the medium's hand and whisper, "He's at peace now." You wonder who's really haunting who. You begin to test your own limits. One night you don't pull the thread. The table still shakes. Coincidence, draft, nerves, or something else. You never find out. The medium fires you the next day, claims you are holding back the spirits. You don't argue. You leave the tools behind. Clarence, the trumpet, the bell wire, all of it. You walk away. But the silence doesn't go with you. You never hear the knocks again, or maybe you do. But this time, it's just the radiator clicking in the walls of your too small flat. Life after the séance isn't dramatic. It's quiet. The kind of quiet you used to fake. Your fingers still twitch when you pass by lace curtains. Your eyes scan for wires in every room. You can't help it. Muscle memory is a powerful thing. So is guilt. You take a normal job, something respectable, filing perhaps, or selling shoes. You keep your head down and your back straight. It's harder than it sounds. You spent a decade crouched like a Victorian gargoyle behind furniture. No one knows who you used to be. No one would believe it anyway. You don't put spectral technician on a CV. You don't tell people that your last job involves squeezing through dumbwaiters in the name of grief relief. You certainly don't mention Clarence. He's in a drawer somewhere, you think. Sometimes someone brings up spiritualism at a party. They say, "My great-aunt saw a medium once, said she spoke to her dead husband." You nod politely. You do not ask for details, because what would you say? That you were there? That you knocked twice to cue the trumpet? That the dead husband quote was lifted from a newspaper ad in 1911? That the woman wept, and you waited for the sobbing to end before quietly exiting through a trapdoor? No, better to let them have it. Because here's the thing, it did help. Not always, but sometimes. Sometimes you saw the weight lift, the breath return. Sometimes you made peace out of gauze and candlelight. And sometimes, though you'll never admit this, you almost believed it yourself. Historians still debate the legacy of the séance boom. Was it a mass deception, a theatre of grief, or a form of emotional care disguised as performance? The answer, like most things from the beyond, is cloudy. But here's what you do know. For every trick you pulled, there was someone who needed to believe it. Someone who chose the illusion. And who are you to say they were wrong? You were the shadow in the corner, the breeze on the back of the neck, the knock in the silence. You were never the ghost. But for a while, you played one very well. Now take a breath. Let your limbs relax one at a time. You've crawled through attics and under tables. You've heard grief like thunder overhead, muffled only by floorboards and velvet. But the séance is over now. The guests have gone. The curtains are open. The lights are back on. You're no longer needed. And that's okay. There's something comforting in the quiet, in knowing that, even without wires or whispers, life goes on. The living adjust, the grieving sleep, and you rest too. Let the stage fade. Let Clarence stay in the drawer. Let the cheesecloth gather dust. You've earned your silence. In the waning heat of an August evening in the year 1894, the air inside the Bennett family's West Side brownstone held the scent of candle wax, damp velvet, and the faint metallic tang of a bell's brass mouth. Clara Bennett sat in darkness, knees tucked beneath her, listening to the muffled shuffle of strangers removing gloves and hats in the parlour beyond. The fishing line between her fingers trembled slightly, its thinness almost lost in the sweat of her palm. She measured its slack by touch alone. Upstairs, in her mother's former sewing room, the shades had been drawn and the gaps stuffed with fabric so no lamplight could intrude. The heavy velvet draperies absorbed what little glow might have crept from the gas sconce in the hall. The stillness was not complete, though. There was always a hint of the city's breath. A far-off carriage wheel struck a loose cobblestone. A child's call echoed faintly in the alley. Even through the walls she could hear the rustle of skirts and the low murmur of polite anticipation. The fishing line ran from Clara's hiding place behind a folding screen to the brass bell, suspended in the centre of the table, just high enough to clear the fingertips of those seated. She had measured it earlier that afternoon, testing the line's smooth pull so the bell would sway gently, as if stirred by the airless hand of someone long dead. In a small wooden box beside her, neatly arranged, lay the other devices of her trade. A strip of white gauze fine as breath, for her materialization, a paper cone for whispering the name of the departed into an unsuspecting ear, and the smallest of tin rattles ready to be rolled across the floorboards. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath. The guests would be ushered in any moment, each one taking a place at the long mahogany table in the centre of the parlour, their hands joined, their eyes eventually sealed in darkness. Clara had been told they were a banker's widow, a society matron curious to disprove her niece's faith, and a newspaperman said to have attended more séances than sermons. She did not mind skeptics. Sometimes they startled more deeply than the believers. From the adjoining room came the voice of Madame Valeska, warm and resonant, the vowels stretched with old-world authority. She was greeting the sitters, guiding them to their chairs. "Let us open our hearts to those beyond the veil," the medium intoned, every syllable rich with the promise of marvels. Clara's fingertips found the gauze. Soon she would drape it over her hair, letting it spill around her shoulders like pale smoke. In that lightless chamber, where the air seemed thick enough to catch the breath, the gauze would glow faintly when a sitter's match flared for a moment's note-taking, then vanish again into the dark. They would swear they had seen a spirit, never suspecting the young woman who waited now, heartbeat slow, fingers ready on the fishing line. Somewhere in the city the bells of St. Luke's were tolling the hour. Here another bell hung silent in the air. Its first chime would come not from heaven, but from Clara Bennett's quiet hand. Clara Bennett had been born in the year 1873 in a narrow brick house on West 29th Street, when the neighbourhood still held a scattering of tradesmen's shops and the smell of the Hudson clung to the air. Her father, Nathaniel Bennett, was a bookbinder with a patient hand and a fondness for pressing tiny wildflowers between the pages of his work. Her mother, Emmeline, kept house and took in small alterations for a dressmaker on 8th Avenue. Her sewing table always littered with spools of thread in muted colours. The Bennets had little in the way of wealth, but their home was never without books. Nathaniel's bindings found their way to the shelves of their parlour, volumes of sermons, poetry, and the curious tales of far-off lands. Clara learned her letters by tracing the gilt titles with her fingertip, mouthing the words as though they were charms. Her father sometimes read aloud after supper, his voice steady as he turned pages, still smelling faintly of glue and leather. When Clara was 9, she first heard talk of spirits. A neighbour, Mrs. Conroy, returned from a sitting with the famed medium Ira Ainsworth, and told her mother of raps that answered questions in a hand cold as marble that had touched her cheek in the dark. Emmeline listened with one brow arched, but Clara leaned closer, spellbound. She began to imagine the raps echoing in their own kitchen, the pale hand reaching for her across the supper table. It was not long before she and her elder brother Henry staged their own parlour wonders. A piece of cheesecloth served as a spirit veil, and an overturned pot became a drum for mysterious knocks. They enlisted the neighbour's cat to wander through at opportune moments, tail brushing the guests' ankles, guests being in truth only 2 indulgent cousins. Henry, though older, had little patience for sustaining the illusion. He would burst into laughter halfway through. Clara, however, took care to lower her voice, to move in stillness, to make every sound deliberate. Even at 10, she understood that what lingered in the mind after the trick was as important as the trick itself. Her schooling was ordinary. A narrow desk in a draughty classroom, ink-stained fingers, arithmetic recited in sing-song with 30 other voices. Yet she preferred the walks home, when the streets filled with the press of carts and the clop of horses, and she could peer into shop windows where the lamps already glowed against the gathering dusk. She took note of shadows and how they altered the shapes of things, how the lamplight caught dust motes so that they drifted like tiny spirits of their own. When Clara was 13, her mother fell ill with the lingering cough that grew worse each winter. By the time the girl was 15, the sewing machine sat silent beneath its cover, and Clara took on more of the household work. She read aloud to her mother in the afternoons, choosing the softer tales from the spiritualist papers, accounts of séances in Boston drawing rooms, of messages from beloved children gone too soon. Emily never claimed to believe, but she would sometimes close her eyes and smile faintly when Clara's voice reached the part where the living and the dead seemed almost near enough to touch. Her father died unexpectedly in the summer of 1889, leaving the family's finances thin as a worn page. Henry had gone to work at a printing house, and Clara, now 16, found herself seeking any position that would keep them in the brownstone. She took a post as a companion to an elderly widow on Washington Square, where she learned to pour tea without a sound to anticipate a need before it was spoken, and, most usefully, to listen without appearing to. It was in that quiet household, surrounded by heavy curtains and the faint tick of the mantel clock, that Clara began to understand the peculiar hunger of the bereaved, not for proof perhaps, but for the comfort of being persuaded. The winter of 1891 brought a slow, relentless snow to New York, softening the clamour of the streets until even Broadway seemed to speak in whispers. Clara, then 18, still served as companion to Mrs. Leffingwell on Washington Square, whose drawing rooms smelled perpetually of orris powder and damp wool. The old widow's cough was worse in the cold, and their excursions dwindled to short walks as far as the corner tobacconist before turning back toward the fire. One late afternoon Mrs. Leffingwell summoned Clara with a thin envelope in her hand. "We have been invited," she said, "to a sitting. Madame Valeska herself." The name was spoken with a kind of reverence. Madame was, by reputation, one of the most celebrated mediums in the city, known for the shimmering spirit veil that seemed to descend around her in the dimness, and for the peculiar gift of producing voices, low or high, male or female, that seemed to speak from the very walls. The séance was held in a townhouse on East 21st Street, its parlour already thick with tobacco smoke and anticipation when they arrived. Clara took a chair at the edge of the circle, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had expected the same crude tricks she and Henry once played at home. What she encountered instead was a finely tuned theatre. The bell that rang without touch, the measured silences between the knocks, the sudden soft voice of a child that seemed to issue from nowhere. Each moment was carefully placed, like stitches hidden in a hem. After the sitting, while Mrs. Leffingwell lingered to thank their hostess, Clara found herself at the elbow of the woman in the flowing silk gown and heavy earrings. "You have the look of one who listens," Madame Valeska said, her accent lilting, her eyes narrowing as though to read a line of text just beneath Clara's skin. "It is a rare gift." Clara could think of no reply but a polite smile. A week later, a note arrived for her at the Leffingwell residence. Madame Valeska, it seemed, required a discreet young woman to assist with the preparation of her sittings, someone with nimble fingers and a calm manner in the dark. The work would be occasional, but paid in cash. Clara hesitated only long enough to consider what Henry's printing wages and her own meagre earnings could not cover. The rising cost of coal, the grocer's bill, the leaking roof of the brownstone. Her first evenings with Madame were spent in dim, lamp-lit rooms before the guests arrived, learning to adjust fishing line so it would not catch on the rough grain of a tabletop, to conceal a strip of luminous gauze beneath a fold of velvet, to breathe in time with the medium's pauses so her own presence dissolved into the darkness. Always less than they expect, Madame advised. Leave space for their longing to fill in the rest. There was, of course, the matter of secrecy. Clara signed no paper, but she understood the terms. To be invisible was to keep the work alive. At first, she thought of it as a sort of stagecraft, like helping with the backdrops at a small theatre. But she soon saw that the sitters were not mere spectators. They came with eyes already damp, with pockets holding small lockets or letters, with questions they had never dared to ask aloud. Her task was not simply to make them believe, it was to help them feel that their belief had been answered. On the evenings when Madame's voice rose in a quaver and the bell shivered in the dark, Clara would sometimes sense the air shift, less from her own devices than from the sudden stillness of those seated. It was as if the entire room leaned toward the same invisible point. She could almost forget herself in those moments, suspended in the shared quiet. By the spring of 1893, she was no longer merely an occasional helper. She had become, in Madame Valeska's word, the right hand that the left hand does not know is moving. From the summer of 1893 onward, Clara's weeks were threaded through with Madame Valeska's appointments. Some were held in the medium's own parlour on East 21st Street, but more often they took place in the drawing rooms of wealthy patrons, homes where the gas sconces were muffled with silk shades, the draperies hung thick enough to swallow street sounds, and the tables gleamed with French polish. The city's noise, horse hooves striking cobblestones, the distant clang of a streetcar bell, was always there, just beyond the closed shutters, like another realm pressing faintly against the séance circle. Preparation was a quiet, methodical ritual. Clara would arrive an hour early, carrying a small carpet bag that rattled faintly when set down. Inside were the essentials: spools of near-invisible fishing line, a bell with a polished wooden handle removed, lengths of gauze, one bleached to a pale ghostly hue, another dusted with luminous paint, a tin of phosphorus powder wrapped tightly in oilcloth, and small well-folded cones of paper to serve as invisible trumpets for whispered replies. The first task was to learn the room. Every new space had its quirks: a table leg that would catch the line, a loose floorboard that might betray her step, a draught from an ill-fitting window sash that could snuff a candle too soon. Clara would test each point, adjusting the height of the bell's cord or the placement of her hiding spot. She often preferred a position behind a screen or within the folds of a heavy curtain, where she could feel the cool plaster wall against her back and measure her movements by the rhythm of the medium's voice. The guests arrived in rustles and murmurs, their faces reflecting every shade of anticipation. There was the stiff scepticism of the clergyman's wife, the guarded hope of the mother who had lost a child, the brisk curiosity of the newspaper man with a notebook tucked just out of sight. Clara could often tell from the way a guest seated themselves whether they would keep their eyes tightly shut or dare to peek into the darkness. When the lights were extinguished, the room became a chamber of breathing and faint shifting. Madame's voice, low and unhurried, filled the space. "We open the circle," she would intone, hands clasped with those beside her. It was then that Clara's part began. She would let the bell sway first, just enough for a single chime, then let the silence deepen before another sound came. Sometimes the gauze would appear in a pale drift above the table, just for a heartbeat, just long enough for a sitter's mind to weave the rest. At moments of heightened emotion, she might roll the small tin rattle across the floor, letting it bump gently against a chair leg before vanishing into stillness again. It was never chaos. Everything followed a pattern Madame had perfected. Sound, silence, faint movement, the tremor of a voice speaking a name. Too much and suspicion grew, too little and the connection broke. Clara learned to read the shifts in the room, the intake of breath, the quiver in a voice, the stilled hands of someone afraid to move. Not all sittings were seamless. There was the evening when a match flared too soon, catching Clara mid-step. She froze against the wall, heart pounding, until darkness returned. Another night, a sceptical guest lunged for the bell just as it rang, only to find nothing but the cool air where the cord had been pulled taut moments earlier. Madame laughed softly, telling them the spirits dislike being handled so roughly. The room relaxed and the circle continued. Over time, Clara's skill became not only in moving unseen, but in shaping what was felt. The clink of a ring against the table, the faint scent of violets from a handkerchief carried in her sleeve, these could be as potent as any ghostly vision. The sitters left convinced not by what they saw, but by what they believed they had experienced. And for Clara, each night's work carried its own private satisfaction. In the unlit spaces between the living and their imagined dead, she had found a role both invisible and essential, her quiet craft hidden beneath layers of shadow and longing. It was in the spring of 1895, during a sitting in a grand Fifth Avenue townhouse, that Clara's careful equilibrium shifted. The hostess was a pale, nervous woman in her early 40s, known in the city for her devotion to séances after the loss of her only son. The drawing room was perfumed with lilies, their sweetness bordering on cloying in the close air. Clara had taken her position behind a panel of damask drapery, the fishing line coiled in her fingers. The circle began in the usual way, Madame's voice low, the sitter's hands linked, the shutters drawn against the pale spring light. Clara let the bell swing once, then again, and heard the expected murmurs of acknowledgement. A whisper through a paper cone carried the boy's name, spoken in Madame's quavering spirit tones. But as the sitting unfolded, the mother began to speak in a low, urgent stream addressing her unseen child. Her words were not the usual questions, no inquiries about comfort in the afterlife or blessings for the living. Instead, she spoke of the guilt she carried, how she had scolded him the morning he drowned, how she had refused his pleas to skip his lessons and go fishing. "If you are here," she whispered into the darkness, "I am sorry, my darling. I am sorry for the last words you heard from me." The room was utterly still. Clara, her fingers poised on the line, felt her chest tighten. She was used to longing in the dark, to the muffled weeping of strangers, but this was different, raw, unguarded, and not shaped for anyone's benefit. In that moment, the bell and the gauze and the quiet stagecraft felt like intrusions. When Madame spoke again, her voice trembled, not in performance but in something close to hesitation. She gave the woman a message of forgiveness, gentle and certain. The mother's sobs broke the stillness. Clara found herself holding the line slack, unwilling to make another sound. After the guests had gone, Madame and Clara packed their things in silence. At last, Madame said quietly, "There are nights when we are not the ones in control, my dear." She offered no further explanation. Clara walked home in the cool dusk, the street lamps haloed in mist, and wondered at the line between comfort and falsehood, whether there were times it did not matter which was which. In the weeks that followed, Clara found herself listening more closely to the sitters' voices, attuned not just to their belief, but to the wounds they carried. She could still pull the line, still shape the shadows, but she did so with a heightened care, leaving longer silences, allowing space for what might rise unbidden. It was not a loss of faith. She had never truly believed in the spirit she helped conjure. but she had begun to feel the weight of being part of something that, for better or worse, could alter the course of a living person's grief. The work went on, Madame's schedule filled as always, yet in Clara's mind, the sound of that mother's voice, fragile, stripped bare, lingered like the echo of a bell that no hand had touched. By the turn of the century, the brownstone on West 29th Street had lost some of its trim polish. Henry had married and moved to Brooklyn, leaving Clara and her ailing mother in the familiar but aging rooms. Madame Valeska's health, too, was faltering. She began to limit her sittings to a small roster of devoted patrons. Clara found herself taking on more of the preparation alone, and in time more of the performance. When Madame could not attend, Clara would appear in her stead, introduced discreetly as Miss Bennett, a trusted associate, and conduct the circle with a voice softened into Madame's careful cadence. The trickery was the same, but she adapted it to her own style. Fewer flourishes, more stillness, a reliance on subtle touches rather than grand manifestations. Her audiences, perhaps sensing the difference, left with a quiet satisfaction. After her mother passed in the spring of 1902, Clara kept the brownstone, letting the upper floor to lodgers whose rent paid the coal merchant and the grocer. She continued her work with Madame when she could, and on her own when she must, moving among the parlours of the city's quieter streets. She never advertised. Her sittings were arranged by word of mouth, passed in careful whispers between acquaintances who valued both discretion and results. In those years, spiritualism began to shift. Some of its grandest names were publicly exposed, their methods laid bare in newspapers eager for scandal. Clara read the accounts without surprise. She'd always known the mechanics, the chords and gauze and human frailty behind it all. What struck her more was how little these revelations seemed to change the needs of the faithful. People still came, still sat in the dark, still reached out into emptiness, hoping to feel something brush their fingers. Her own role had grown quieter. She found herself spending more time listening to the living than calling upon the dead. In the dimness, she would let a sitter speak uninterrupted, offering no more than a faint chime, or the whisper of a name at the right moment. Some nights there was no performance at all, only a shared silence, which the guest left believing was filled with presence. By the winter of 1910, Clara worked less often. The lodgers kept her solvent, and she found a small pleasure in tending the rooms herself, polishing the banisters, arranging fresh flowers in the front hall, keeping a pot of tea ready for the rare caller. She began to walk in the afternoons through Madison Square and down to the piers, where she would watch the great ships departing for ports she had never seen. She never married. Whether by choice or circumstance, she remained Miss Bennett to her neighbours, a quiet, neatly dressed woman who seemed always to be listening for something beyond the immediate moment. Those who knew her better spoke of her kindness, her ability to sit with a grieving friend without pressing advice or platitudes. The city around her quickened. Electric lights replaced gas. Motor cars rattled over the paving stones, and new buildings rose where she had once known stables and small shops. But in her brownstone rooms the pace remained her own. She kept in the bottom drawer of her writing desk the bell and fishing line, the gauze folded in its oilcloth, and the little tin rattle. She rarely took them out, but she could not quite bring herself to part with them. They were, in a way, the tools by which she had shaped her life. In the later years of her life, Clara Bennett came to think of her long work in parlours and drawing rooms, not as a trade, nor even as an art, but as a kind of quiet ministry. She had been, in her own way, a custodian of other people's longing, guiding it, shaping it, giving it form, for a few brief moments in the dark. If it was an illusion, it was one that often left its witnesses calmer than when they arrived. She would sit some afternoons by the parlour window of the brownstone, watching the changing city pass below, children skipping past on their way to school, the pale blur of an omnibus horse in winter fog, the stoop sellers calling out their wares in voices that carried even through the glass. Her hands, once deft in the dark, now rested quietly in her lap. The fishing line and gauze lay untouched in the drawer upstairs, their edges softened with time. Clara never sought to justify her work. She knew it for what it was, careful craft, illusion, and sometimes, by some alchemy of timing and silence, something approaching truth. Not truth in the strict sense, but the truth people found in themselves when given the space to speak to their dead. She had seen hardened men's eyes wet with tears and sceptical lips soften into faint, wondering smiles. When she thought back to that spring evening on Fifth Avenue, to the mother who had whispered her regrets into the stillness, she felt again the weight of that moment. It was not the bell or the gauze that had made it powerful, but the unguarded voice of the living, reaching into the unseen. That was the part of her work she carried most deeply, the knowledge that even in a room arranged for trickery, there could be something real. As the years went on, the parlours that had once hosted her circles grew fewer. Spiritualism's height had passed. Its great names were gone or discredited, its younger adherents drawn to other fads and philosophies. But a few still came to her brownstone on quiet evenings, sitting across from her at the small kitchen table with only a candle between them. She no longer dimmed the lights entirely, nor called upon elaborate devices. The candle's flame, the sound of her steady breathing and a willingness to listen were often enough. Clara Bennett died in her own bed one autumn morning in the year 1928, the city just stirring beyond her shuttered window. A neighbour found her, peaceful, with her hands folded as if resting between tasks. Among her small effects, the bell and its worn cord remained, along with a single folded sheet of gauze. No one knew precisely what she had done with them, or the rooms in which they had played their part. But those who had sat with her, whether in shadow or candlelight, remembered her not for the illusions, but for the stillness she could hold between one heartbeat and the next. The gas lamps had been turned down until the room was more shadow than light, just a faint amber breathing from the hallway beyond. Curtains swayed with the draught from a door that had been shut moments earlier. Around the polished mahogany table, hands rested lightly on the wood, fingertips trembling, not from the cold but from the careful holding of breath. Somewhere in that thickened dark, a faint chime rang out. It was the delicate music of a small bell, the kind a child might keep in a toy box. Then came the slow, almost bashful squeal of a trumpet mouthpiece being drawn through the air, as if by invisible fingers. A widow in black crepe gasped, her rings clinking against the tabletop. Beyond her, just outside the arc of candlelight, the séance assistant moved in silence. Their shoes were wrapped in felt to muffle a step, their sleeves heavy with hidden pockets. They knew precisely where the floorboards complained and where they stayed obediently quiet. From the darkness, a length of gauze, faintly luminous with phosphorus, drifted upward like a shivering wisp of breath. It hung in the air just long enough to be noticed, then was gone, drawn back into a concealed hand. The sitters, most of them recently acquainted with loss, leaned forward into the gloom, half believing they had seen the veil between worlds lift. And the assistant, part stagehand, part conjurer, part shadow, waited for the next cue, the next breathless gasp. Outside, a hansom cab rattled past on wet cobblestones, its iron-shod wheels hissing in the drizzle. But in here, nothing existed but the circle, the darkness, and the certainty, at least for this moment, that the dead were near. It began, as so many new professions do, not as a profession at all, but as an improvisation. The earliest days of spiritualism in the 1840s and 50s, when the Fox sisters of Hydesville first reported hearing the ghostly raps that answered their questions, had no assistants in the formal sense. Mediums worked alone or with trusted friends, the room holding only those they claimed to summon and those who came to witness. But as the movement grew, and the parlours of small towns could no longer contain the audiences, the work changed. By the 1880s, the séance had become both a devotional rite and a travelling entertainment. In the United States, railways carried mediums from Boston to Chicago, from New Orleans to small prairie towns where broadside posters promised messages from beyond. In Britain, halls from Brighton to Manchester filled with the murmuring and expectant. Mediums, often women in modest gowns and lace collars, were the public face. But behind that face there needed to be a hidden architecture, a machinery of sensation. The séance assistant emerged to serve that need. Sometimes they were a spouse or sibling bound by loyalty, sometimes a hired hand paid in discreet envelopes. They were trained to know not only the tools, trumpets with collapsible stems, tambourines strung with ribbon, curtains weighted just enough to move like breath, but also the timing, the rhythm of human attention. Part of their work drew from older trades. The stagehands of Victorian theatres already knew how to make ghosts walk across boards with lanterns and mirrors. Carnival workers could summon a shriek from nowhere or a phantom hand from a false panel. Some assistants were poached directly from these worlds, their skills adapted from the boards of Drury Lane to the front parlours of mourning families. And why did the role flourish at that particular moment? It was in part the century's peculiar marriage of grief and technology. The telegraph had taught people that messages could cross vast distances without a visible carrier. The photograph had frozen a face beyond death. Why then could a voice not return from the grave? In that climate, the assistant's careful illusions were not necessarily seen as deceit, but as a service, whether to faith, to consolation, or simply to wonder. The machinery of a séance was never left to chance. Every room, every object within it, was prepared with the care of a military campaign, though one fought in whispers and velvet shadows. A séance assistant's duties began long before the first sitter removed their gloves. They would arrive early, often under the guise of a servant setting the room in order. In a hired hall, they checked that the blackout curtains overlapped fully, that no stray light from a street lamp could pierce the illusion. In a private drawing room, they rearranged chairs and side tables, leaving space where they knew they would need to pass unseen. The tools themselves were simple to the eye, but cunning in their making. Trumpets, long flared tubes said to amplify spirit voices, might be weighted at the narrow ends so they could swing or hover from nearly invisible black wires. Tambourines, small and bright with ribbon, were rigged with cords fine enough to vanish in low light. Gauze strips were treated with luminous paint that glowed faintly in the dark, mimicking the ectoplasmic forms so much discussed in spiritualist circles. Even bells could be fixed to spring devices hidden beneath the table, triggered by a squeeze or a shift of weight. The hierarchy, though unspoken, was firm. The medium was the star, the voice of the spirits. The assistant was the stage manager, technician, and often the protector. It was their task to guard the medium from too curious hands during the materializations, to intercept an overzealous sitter who might try to seize a trumpet or pull back a curtain. Some assistants stood silent in the room itself, masked by darkness. Others worked from beyond a false wall or under a raised platform, their hands reaching through concealed openings at just the right moment. Communication between medium and assistant was a delicate art. A cough could mean begin the wrappings. A shift in the medium's breathing might signal that the luminous gauze should appear. Timing was everything. An early sound could break the spell, a late one might go unnoticed entirely. In the United States, seances in large halls sometimes employed more than one assistant. One among the sitters to direct their attention, another in the shadows to manage the effects. In Britain, where drawing rooms and small parlours were more common, a single assistant often did it all, moving with the precise confidence of someone who knew the room as well as their own skin. It was invisible work and meant to stay that way. To be noticed was to fail. The applause, the tears, the whispered thank yous at the end of the night, those were for the medium. The assistants slipped away in silence, their tools wrapped in cloth, their footsteps disappearing into the city's dark streets. In those years, death was everywhere. In the United States, the memory of the Civil War still hung over families, its unmarked graves stretching across fields from Virginia to Tennessee. In Britain, cholera, influenza, and the harsh toll of industrial life claimed thousands each year. Few households were untouched by loss. Spiritualism in this climate was more than a diversion, it was a salve. For the devout, seances promised reunion. For the doubtful, they offered at least the theatre of it. To sit in a darkened room and hear a mother's voice or see a child's small hand extend from the gloom was a kind of balm that sermons and scripture could not always give. The seance assistant was part of that balm, though their role was never acknowledged in public. They were the invisible midwives of these moments, delivering not babies but brief, shining illusions of return. The public did not know their names, but without them the miracles of the medium would have been far fewer. For some, the ethics of this were clear. They believed the spirits were real, and the assistant's work simply helped the audience perceive what was already there. Others saw it as pure artifice, but one that could be justified by the comfort it gave. In both America and Britain, newspapers printed exposés of fraudulent mediums, photographs of assistants in spirit costumes, diagrams showing hidden compartments in cabinets. Yet these revelations never quite destroyed the movement. Each exposure was met with both outrage and defense. Believers claimed the true mediums were being slandered, while skeptics took the stories as proof of what they had always suspected. Among the working classes, seances could be a rare luxury, a night of wonder bought for the price of a music hall ticket. Among the wealthy, private sittings became a fashionable entertainment, something to be whispered about over tea. In either setting, the cultural meaning was layered. Grief, curiosity, the thrill of the uncanny, and the quiet relief of seeing, if only for a moment, that those who had gone might not be entirely gone. The assistant, for their part, existed between worlds not only in the séance but in society. They were neither fully performer nor fully labourer. They moved in the company of the bereaved, the credulous, the wealthy, and the learned, but without belonging wholly to any of them. They were shadows serving shadows, their work vanishing the moment the gas lamps came up. For the séance assistant, the day began not at the hour of the performance, but much earlier, often in the quiet of late morning. If the séance was to be held in a hired hall, there were arrangements to confirm. The blackout curtains to be hung, the chairs to be set in a tight ring, the small table to be placed precisely at the centre. In a private home, the work was subtler. folding away a carpet to reveal the noiseless boards, persuading the host to move a heavy armoire that would block the assistant's path in the dark. Their tools were kept in trunks and valises whose ordinary appearance was part of their safety. Inside lay the paraphernalia of the craft. Lengths of fine black cord, bell mechanisms no bigger than a child's hand, telescoping trumpets, tambourines, gauze treated with luminous paint, small tins of phosphorus or lycopodium powder. Each item had its own wrapping to prevent a telltale rattle. In cities, these cases travelled on trams or in hansom cabs. In rural towns, they might be carried on foot from the station, passed off as the belongings of a stage musician or travelling salesman. Afternoons were for rehearsal. If the medium and assistant had worked together for years, these might be only brief run-throughs. A cough here, a whispered now, there. With a new partnership, hours could be spent perfecting the order of effects. The first raps to announce the spirits, the bell to confirm their presence, the sudden luminous flare to mark a materialization. The assistant learned to feel the medium's body language in the dark, to catch the subtle tightening of a shoulder that meant ready, the release that meant enough. The seances themselves were a test of nerve and balance. Moving through darkness was its own skill. One learned to skim past skirts and boots without brushing them, to pass close enough for a sitter to feel a chill but not a touch. There was the constant risk of detection, of a hand suddenly shooting out to grab the trumpet, of a match being struck in suspicion. In such moments, the assistant's calm was their shield. A dropped prop could be disguised as a message from an unruly spirit. A caught cord could be blamed on the clumsy movement of a sitter's foot. After the final hymn or prayer, while the medium offered her last consoling words, the assistant began to dismantle the night's illusions. Cords were unhooked, gauze folded, bells stilled. In some homes, this work had to be done before the lamps were relit, the evidence hidden away before light could fall on it. Late at night, tools repacked, they stepped back into the world outside, a world of horse hooves, fog, and the smell of coal smoke. Their own lodgings were often modest, a small room in a boarding house, a rented attic over a shop. Pay varied wildly, sometimes a few shillings, sometimes a generous sum if the sitters were wealthy and the manifestations impressive. It was, in truth, a life lived mostly in the margins. Long waits in the dark, moments of sudden precision, the odd mingling of artifice and faith. Yet for those who practiced it well, the work could be oddly satisfying. They had for an hour or two drawn a curtain across the ordinary world, and behind it allowed others to believe, to feel, and to grieve in their own strange, theatrical way. By the final years of the 19th century, the seance assistant's craft was already beginning to change. Technology, the very force that had once seemed to make spirit communication plausible, now threatened to unmask it. The arrival of portable electric lamps meant that suspicious sitters or determined investigators could flood a darkened room with light in a heartbeat. Photography too crept into the seance chamber, promising to capture manifestations, but just as often catching the telltale hand or wire. In both Britain and America, societies for psychical research formed, their members educated, sceptical, and determined to test mediums under what they called scientific controls. For assistants, these were dangerous times. Conditions were imposed. The medium's hands and feet held throughout, the rooms searched, the lights dimmed but not extinguished. The cleverest adapted, inventing new methods that could survive partial illumination, concealed rods, silk threads invisible in candlelight, clever use of the sitters themselves as unwitting accomplices. Public appetite shifted too. The grand, hours-long séances of the 1880s gave way to briefer demonstrations, sometimes as part of mixed-bill entertainments in music halls. In America, vaudeville seized upon the visual drama of spirit manifestations, stripping away the solemnity and turning it into an act between the comedians and the dancers. Some assistants followed their mediums into this new world, trading hushed reverence for applause. Others left entirely, taking their talents to the theatre, the carnival sideshow, or the burgeoning world of moving pictures, where illusions were welcome without any pretense of supernatural truth. By the 1920s, the spiritualist movement faced fresh competition. Radio voices that could speak into the home without wires, gramophone records that could replay the tones of the dead without darkness or the ceremony. The First World War had given a brief revival to séances, as families sought word from sons and brothers lost in the trenches. But with peace came disillusionment, and the hunger for public proof of spirits waned. In Britain, some mediums still commanded loyal circles, their assistants aging alongside them, preserving the old ways with stubborn care. In the United States, the last touring séances of the decade often relied on nostalgia as much as mystery, the assistant's tools worn smooth by decades of use. Yet the role never vanished entirely. In quieter corners, in private rooms, far from the reach of reporters and investigators, the séance assistant continued to work. The same careful steps in the same darkness, offering the same fleeting comfort. And in their way, they preserved not only a trade, but a peculiar chapter in the history of how the living and the dead have been persuaded to meet. In the stillness after a séance, when the chairs had been pushed back and the last of the sitters had drifted into the night, the room often held a peculiar hush. Not the emptiness of a space abandoned, but something softer, a lingering warmth, as if the air still remembered the voices spoken within it. The séance assistant knew that feeling well. They had worked for it, cultivated it, and yet could never quite claim it. Their craft was never meant to leave a monument. No brass plaques bore their names, no playbills listed their part. They lived in service to moments that dissolved as quickly as they formed, like breath on glass. And perhaps that was the point. Their work was not to be seen, but to be felt. A weightless touch in the dark, the drift of gauze in the air, the pause before a bell chimed. In an age when bereavement sat openly in the parlour and the mourning clothes might be worn for years, the assistant's presence in that darkened circle gave shape to the unseen. Whether one believed or not, the experience was real in the moment. The intake of breath, the rush of recognition, the comfort, sometimes desperate, that the world beyond was not entirely silent. Now, a century later, their world has faded into history. The dim gaslight, the whispering rooms, the hiss of coal outside the curtained window, these are gone. Yet the idea they served endures. We still turn to theatre, to ritual, to small acts of artifice in the hope of touching something beyond ourselves. For the séance assistant, the magic was never in the gauze or the wires. It was in holding the fragile space where longing could become belief, and belief could, if only for an hour, feel like truth. And now, that silence lingers, the table stands still, its polished surface cooling in the empty room. The curtains have been drawn again, hiding the street lamp's glow. Somewhere the scent of candle wax fades into the faint smell of dust and old upholstery. Even the air seems to have settled, thick and unmoving, as though it too is tired from the evening's work. Outside the world is quieting. A cart rattles once, far away, then nothing but the hush of midnight air. Inside, each object rests in its proper place. The folded drapery, the waiting chairs, the blank-eyed photographs watching from their frames. It is not for us to know what was real and what was arranged. That question drifts out into the dark like smoke, losing shape until it's only a trace. What remains is gentler, the stillness after voices, the calm that comes when no one needs to pretend anymore. Somewhere the assistant lies down in their narrow bed. They will not dream of knocking tables or whispering spirits tonight. Perhaps they'll think only of the dim parlour light, or the faint warmth of a teacup in their hand before it cooled. Small things, steady things, and you, here in your own quiet room, you may let the day's questions slip their hold. The world can manage without you until morning. There is nothing left to arrange, nothing left to perform. Rest now. The candles are cold, the voices are gone, and the dark is kind. Sleep well, and may your dreams be gentler than the work you've done today.